I have two brief questions I'd like to ask, if I may.
Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone and you're watching The Daily Question. Today's question of the day: what's wrong with Bill Maher's criticisms of the late Stan Lee? Now, I'm going to read to you from an article, so if you haven't heard, you'll know exactly what Bill Maher has said, and then I will respond and give my thoughts on his comments. And so the opening salvo here, I'm jumping in partway through. This is a quote I'm starting with from Bill Maher that he wrote on his blog. "America is in mourning, deep, deep mourning for a man who inspired millions to, I don't know, watch a movie, I guess," Maher wrote about Lee's passing in a blog post on his website Saturday. And quoting Maher again, "Someone on Reddit posted, 'I'm so incredibly grateful I lived in a world that included Stan Lee. Personally, I'm grateful I lived in a world that included oxygen and trees, but each to his own.'" Although the comedian said he has nothing against comic books, he added that when he was growing up, comics were for kids, and when you grew up, you moved on to big boy books without the pictures. But then 20 years or so ago, something happened. Adults decided they didn't have to give up kid stuff, he said, and so they pretended that comic books were actually sophisticated literature. Maher concluded, "I don't think it's a huge stretch to suggest that Donald Trump could only get elected in a country that thinks comic books are important." So what's wrong with what Bill Maher said here? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let me explain. First of all, 4 things that struck me about his comments straight away. Stan Lee had not long just passed away. He had just died. And it seems to me there was absolutely no reason to be mounting such a cynical and jaded response in the wake of another human being's death. Stan Lee was not a bad guy. He was a guy who had a great creative genius, and he contributed a lot of fun and entertainment and enjoyment to the world. And it seems that he wasn't a guy who was sort of highly politicised or unpopular with a lot of people either. And so it just strikes me as strange that anyone at the passing of another human being, especially a human being who was so well loved, would take this kind of tone in response to their death. It just seems a little too cynical for my liking. The second thing that struck me about Bill Maher's response was his comments about living in a world of oxygen and trees. And for some reason, it sort of reminded me of that hard rationalistic scientism and skepticism and that sort of materialist view of the world, which wants to strip out any of the sort of, I guess, the wonder and the profound imagination and creative imagination that really comes with mythology. And there's something really good about mythology. It's interesting how many sort of popular scientists you will hear actually talking about how it was mythology that actually got them into the field of science. Reading this kind of comic book literature or watching Star Wars and Star Trek and things like this actually invoked in them a sense of wonder and a desire to advance themselves in the career of science. So I think it's absurd and a false dichotomy to suggest that, you know, the world is somehow better off with only one of these things. We actually need both. Yeah, trees, oxygen, great. Science is awesome, but so is mythology, and so is the literature and the authors and the creators who bring us that mythology. It opens up our minds, our world, to a sense of wonder, to the sense of perhaps beauty and goodness and truth. It's an imperfect grasping at some profoundly important truths about the human experience. The third thing, of course, that struck me was Bill Maher's comments about Donald Trump and the suggestion that it's a bunch of adults who haven't actually grown up and they're still reading comic books, and that's why Donald Trump got elected. Well, the obvious response here is to say, okay, let's go back in time just a little bit and have a look at what happened in Germany. You all know where I'm going with this, because Germany was the most academically, literature, science, technology, it was the most advanced society of the day. It was the leading society. Comic books were not a big thing in that German society, which went and elected and then carried on with and enabled the actions of Adolf Hitler. So if the worst you can say is that you ended up with a guy who says oafish things in office as your president, I don't think you're doing too badly. And I think it's quite absurd to suggest that somehow that comic books are responsible for this anyway. It's a very reductionist, a simplistically childish and very unintelligent reduction of what actually happened in that 2016 election to try and pin it on one factor here, and that's apparently your belief that too many people of the wrong age are reading comic books. And lastly, of course, is his suggestion that basically you're supposed to get to a point where you just grow up and stop reading comic books. Now, there is a kernel of truth here. There is actually something important that he's getting at here. And the kernel of truth, of course, is that we do have a lot of people now in our culture who are experiencing effectively what is sometimes referred to as a failure to launch, or a failure to launch syndrome. Basically, adults who get stuck in a state of perpetual adolescence. And there's no doubt that if all you were doing was reading comic books and nothing else, there would be a problem. If you were a man in your 20s, 30s, 40s, and that's all you were doing, I would suggest to you there is a problem. I still read comic books from time to time, but I also read other literature as well. I try and read a book a week. Lately, I've been a bit pressed for time, so it's sort of a book a fortnight or a book every 3 weeks. But I also chuck in a comic book every now and then as well for a bit of lighter entertainment. There's nothing wrong with that. It's actually quite a good thing, I think, for adults to have a bit of childlike wonder in their life from time to time, even on a regular basis. But yes, however, he is right. If you're going to stick yourself in a world where all you are doing is consuming comic books and nothing else, and you are trying to use those comic books as the sole source of wisdom and guidance in your life, like some sort of, holy scriptures from the great prophet Stan Lee, then you are going to be in trouble if you do that. But I would suggest that's not actually what's happening in the vast majority of cases at all. And it's certainly not why people celebrated the life of Stan Lee. There's just no doubting the creative legacy that this guy left behind him. It is something worthy of celebrating. Here's a guy who got on with using his giftings and the skills and the tools that he brought to the world in a way that impacted millions upon millions of people and helped them to dream big dreams, to have a big sense of imagination and wonder about the world, and to be entertained and get a bit of enjoyment out of life. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's a really good thing that I think is worth celebrating. And ultimately, Bill Maher here just comes across like a bit of a cynical old curmudgeon, a bit of a grinchy Grinch who just can't see the good in the world anymore. I don't know why he made his comments, but I think they're a huge mistake. Please let me know what you think in the comment section below. And if you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please support me on PayPal or Patreon. That's right, I can hear my theme music too. I'll see you tomorrow on The Daily Question.